Sacrifice and the Scapegoat, a sociological case for the Christian vision. So what is a scapegoat? A scapegoat, here is an image I found on the internet, which says Americans, straight, Chinese, the poor, Jews, men's, liberals, gays, Muslims, blacks, conservatives, Christians. Within different communities at different points of time in history, certain categories of people were marginalized and persecuted proactively, and they were basically scapegoated. That means that in the narrative and the story, which gives coherence to groups and to communities, what binds them together, includes a kind of othering, of human beings who are not considered fully persons. Their fundamental human dignity is overlooked in this narrative, in this story, and they are made a scapegoat. Okay, think of it this way: think of the collective sins of the group, the collective shadow, the collective evil within their own hearts and within their own character and in their own daily behavior. Think of all of that great shadow as finding something to project onto, finding a locus of its projection. And the group then projects all of this hate, basically, this evil, this dense, dark, shadowy energy onto the scapegoat. And the scapegoat is then basically hunted and basically sacrificed is what happens. The scapegoat is sacrificed to ensure the order, the coherence, and the longevity of the group. This image of the scapegoat as a symbol comes from the Jewish religious traditions, which stretch back centuries, and in particular Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, in which traditionally 2 goats would be brought to the temple. One goat was killed, its blood was let, and its blood was flicked within the interior of the temple, and was basically given devotionally to the Holy of Holies, to Yahweh, the God of Israel himself. One god was given for that purpose up on high, basically, and then another goat was cast out below, basically, into the wild. And this other goat was loosed into the wilderness, and it was called the goat for Azazel. So the goat is on the edge of the community. It's actually outside of the temple. And so there's 2 goats in Yom Kippur, you see, one for the inside the temple and one for outside of the temple. The scapegoat is cast outside of the temple. So you can bring this to an analogy of a social group where the temple is the sacred unity and cohesion of their value system, their belief system, and the whatever aspects of other people's humanity, their sexuality, their race, whatsoever, their gender, whatsoever it is then picked as a category to channel the collective shadow of this temple, this group that is cohering around a sacred set of principles. And basically, Jordan Peterson would describe this as a novelty in the system, actually a novelty outside of the system. So the group is basically othering an aspect of, they're othering an aspect of humanity and are blind to the universal human dignity of the human soul made in the image of God. So there is a kind of unconscious projection, is what I'm arguing. That's a Jungian kind of argument. The group is projecting evil, hate onto a category of human being and treating them as nothing. There are many examples of this in many different cultures, and I'm going to run through some of those with slides now visually. But anyway, in the Jewish tradition, this scapegoat on the edge, is cast out of the temple onto the edge, at the bottom of the mountain, you could say, down the mountain, you could say, out into the demonic realm, where Azazel, or Azazel, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this one, is a demon, basically, who is the principal ruling over this goat for Azazel. So there's this very deep mythological idea at work in this notion of the scapegoat. And it has a sociological import, as I've been trying to explain, with the way in which tribal groups and communities in ancient times tried to establish coherence and unity by othering and scapegoating and persecuting you. This kind of projection out, Jung looked at as the projection of unconscious energies out. So I really want to just underline that. So Jesus Christ in the New Testament, also went into the wilderness, you see. And so there's an analogy there between the scapegoat who is cast out into Azazel at the bottom of the mountain in the wilds of the world, in the unformed edges of the world, away from the hearth and the temple and the divine theophany, the union of heaven and earth, the Lord Yahweh, the God of Israel. As far from that as you can get out into the wild, see. This is where Jesus found himself in the New Testament. And there he was tempted by a demon, by the prince of darkness, the ruler of all demons, Satan himself. And this is basically Christ's encounter with Azazel. Now, I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I'd like to, if you know more about this, I'd like to hear from you what you think on this. But I think there's an association between Satan and Azazel. At least one level of narrative commonality is that they're both demons, which means they're both rebellious spiritual principles. Anyway, so we've got Satan, we've got Azazel associated with the scapegoat, you see. So in another culture, during the Aztec culture, which would have been basically in the like about a millennium ago kind of thing, from the year 1000 onwards, I think, to like 1400, and in the 16th century, basically the mid 16th century, or the late 15th, I'm not quite sure there, the Spanish encountered the Aztecs, and the Aztecs are practicing this, and you can see it here, basically ripping someone's heart out. And the reason they're doing that is to kind of appease the sun and ensure the cycle of maize, corn production for their sustenance. This is my understanding of some of the reasons behind it, but the reasons behind the sacrifice vary. The point is that this is a rather brutal example of this scapegoating mechanism in human beings, where one of the human beings is offered as a sacrifice to Azazel, or Satan, and cast out. And so this person's body is dismembered and fragmented. That means he moves away from wholeness and health into parts and fragments. And it's a very brutal thing to happen to a human being. It's a desecrating thing, actually. Desecrating the image of God. It's desecrating the wholeness of our being. And that scattering imagery, that fragmentation imagery, is connected with Azazel and with Satan, and actually with Diabolos, which is a Greek word, diabolos, the devil. The devil is the principle of discord, you see. Interestingly, one of the Aztec deities to which they sacrificed was called Smoking Mirror, as I understand it, who is connected with discord, basically, discord and fragmentation as well. So you've got smoking mirror, you've got Azazel, you've got Satan, Diabolos, the devil. Several different spiritual principles there, connected mythologically by the idea of fragmentation, the outside of the temple, the profane, and the world being torn apart, basically, thrown into discord. This is an Aztec image of smoking mirror. So, of course, the scapegoat motif is taken up in Soviet propaganda, and here's Lenin sweeping away a whole bunch of undesirables, wealthy people with monarchical status. Not sure what figure this is, but basically, really, there's an othering process here going on, right? There's an inversion of the hierarchy, the rich, the wealthy, the economically successful. Are going to be swept away by Lenin. You see, there's a flipping of the hierarchy. The kings, the authorities, the traditional authorities, swept away. So there's this flip like that. Anyway, the point here is that they are being scapegoated now. You see, the scapegoats are the rich, the scapegoats are the bourgeois classes, and the revolution of the proletariat and the communist revolution can be understood if we understand the mythological importance of the bourgeoisie. They were scapegoated, and it was a narrative of propaganda and scapegoating which fueled the Soviet machine. At a more dark political level, Stalin, of course, and his purges and his political purges of political opponents was another kind of othering and scapegoating, a casting of my shadow and a projection like this. Oh, and here we have an image of Nazi propaganda, Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda. Really horrifying stuff. Really horrifying stuff. And so what my contention to you is, you see, is that there is a scapegoat who is God become man, is the Christian theological vision, that the God of Israel, Yahweh, the one God of Israel, became incarnate, that a virgin, Mary, divinely conceived, and he had a human body and a human existence. His flesh, you could touch his face, you could touch his hands, you could touch. You see. And so there's an incarnation which is really at the center of the Christian vision and the Christian revelation. So what I want to argue is that there's a kind of meta pattern for eternity, for the whole of mankind, where the narrative of Christ in the New Testament is another it's another scapegoat sort of story and another sacrifice story, but it's gathering up the stories of the scapegoats, which I've just told you there, into it in a very important way, because Christ is the ultimate scapegoat in Rome. The Romans would have roads filled with crosses, and now the cross has become a symbol of peace, a symbol of humble reverence, a symbol of love, and the outpouring of agape, the outpouring of love for humanity, for eternity. And you see Christ, through resisting not evil and through taking the sins of the world onto him as the scapegoat, you see. But being God, being so full of love that this love finally overcomes all of that hate and all of that othering, you see, because it's an inversion. Through the othering, he is the thing othered, but he is God, the abundant source and creation of the whole reality. So that has a very powerful effect on the othering, and it's almost like It's like evil is finally overcome by the deep magic of love, which is what C.S. Lewis and J.K. Rowling both understand and weave into their narratives. The deep magic before time, I think it is in what Aslan says. Harry Potter understands this magic too, you know, this outpouring of himself in agape, this taking on of the sacrificial burden and this taking up of his cross, you see, and this becoming the scapegoat, basically. And here are some things that Christ has said, you see. He said, turn the other cheek. So when I'm doing this, I'm persecuting this thing, I'm scapegoating this thing, and this scapegoating impulse will lead to violence, lead to discord, and lead to a cycle where I will then become scapegoated because I have done this, and an eye for an eye is the cycle of justice that plays out. An eye for an eye. I hurt you, I scapegoat you, you hit back, and the cycle continues infinitely. Or not infinitely, it's continued, and it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. Right? It's called retaliatory violence or justice, and a primitive form of justice, we could say. So turn the other cheek inverts this, right? It does invert this because if I resist not evil, if I become the scapegoat, if I am the scapegoat, if the Lord and King is a scapegoat, the Lord and King of all creation, if the Lord and King of all creation is a scapegoat, and I'm supposed to imitate that or aspire to be like that, which is the Christian idea, then I must turn the other cheek, and I must not respond with my attention or energy towards provocation from people who are scapegoating, because that mechanism is broken finally by Jesus Christ. The mechanism of scapegoating is broken, reversed. Something major happens, because now the icon of all salvation is a crucifix, and is a man's body, is basically a scapegoated man in the first century Rome. A scapegoated man in first century Rome becomes the king of the world. That's the Christian story, and that plays out in history when Constantine converts the Roman Empire. That is the consecration of the inversion. Christ has become king of the empire, and yet he was the lowest of the low and was cast for Azazel, for Satan, into the realm of Diabolos, and yet it was overcome. Resist not evil is the other thing Christ says, you know, just resist not evil. Harry Potter offers himself to Voldemort as a sacrifice. Lily Potter gives herself for Harry as a sacrifice. Aslan lets the White Witch have her way with him. And through this, a deep magic is ushered in, and the powers of evil are finally broken in these narratives through the inversion of this traditional scapegoating, or should I say the embracing of it, like becoming the victim. This is what Christ did. You know, he became the victim. He became the locus of all of the world's hate and all of the world's evil. And in that ultimate humiliation, that humilitas, that humility, that ultimate surrender, he exhausted the tyrannical powers of evil. He exhausted them because love is abundant. Yeah, so I just explained this bit, becoming the scapegoat willingly, accepting your cross. So my contention really in this video is that Christianity inverts the scapegoat motif by not adopting a system of retaliatory violence. If I am persecuted, I persecute you back twice as bad. Instead, it's if I am persecuted, I am persecuted. And this is because the king, the Lord of all creation, was a persecuted man. He was a man at the fringes of Roman identity, a man made a scapegoat, scapegoated, you see. The collective unconscious feeling, the evil, the shadow was pointed at him, directed at him, and it led to his death. But he was resurrected. Such is the Christian belief. His life renewed, and through this he accomplished a victory over the powers of evil that had scapegoated him, and finally is a narrative, but finally constellates a narrative that inverts this ancient primordial scapegoating pattern, which is there in the Aztecs, which is there in the Romans, which is there in everywhere, really. Everywhere had sacrifice, everywhere would other people and sacrifice them, and is there in Nazi Germany, and is there in the Soviet Union. So we must remember those things. We must recognize these deep patterns of scapegoating, how we do it in our own lives, how communities do it, schools, workplaces, industries, different things like this. How is scapegoating going on? What happens if you do genuinely turn the other cheek? What happens if you do genuinely accept your cross and instead of retaliate to persecution or discord, to embrace that suffering and embrace that cross, and in so doing, take away all of the power of the devil or Azazel or Satan. Take away all of that power, because all of that power is based in all of that power is based in their persecution of the scapegoat and the resistance of that scapegoat to that persecution, but in the full, humble and humiliating acceptance, kind of hollowing out or emptying of oneself in love for the one who was the ultimate scapegoat. There is a power in that, and that is the power of martyrdom. And Irenaeus, of course, says that martyrdom, the blood of the martyrs, is the seed of the church. And so we have the Christian church because of the martyrs and because of the power of martyrdom. The power of humiliation, the power of being scapegoated, instead of being a scapegoat and having your heart ripped out, as in the Aztecs, for example. The martyr's death became a symbol of renewal, of resurrection, of new life, and of the kingdom of God. And that's a very powerful meaning, a very powerful new meaning that had emerged, and that gave the martyrs power, a symbolic power that no king or prince or warrior or leader could in any way touch, because they only had the power of the sword, you see. But the power of God is self-sacrifice. The power of God is kind of in becoming the scapegoat in a very profound way. So the Christian story is arguably a story of stories in that sense, or the telos, the end of scapegoat cycles, basically. You have this retaliatory violence scapegoat cycle. Well, there's a telos, there's an end, there's a key to that cycle. And that key is a kind of narrative pattern. And my argument is that Christianity preserves that narrative pattern in an important way. So this argument can be made basically purely sociologically. I'm talking about how violence is reduced. I'm talking about how peace is attained. I'm talking about how forgiveness binds the world anew in a new form and in a new way that is not based on violence and is not based on scapegoating. through resisting not evil, basically, through accepting the cross. So these are things I'm thinking through proactively at the moment on an ongoing basis. So I just wanted to make a relatively informal video to share some thoughts on this with you. Thank you so much for listening.